You found why we are Christians. My name is Kent Philpott, and what you're going to see is a conversational interview with someone who is an actual Christian, and his name is Alan Coleman. Welcome, Alan.
Thanks. I appreciate it, Kent.
All right. So we get to have a chance to talk together. It was really good driving over here in the car and getting to know each other a little bit.
Weather's a little warm, but yeah.
Yeah. Now, the last name's Coleman.
Yes.
That's a Coleman.
Yes,
Okay.
like the camping equipment.
Where were you born, Alan?
Where?
Where?
I was born in East LA, Whittier specifically. I was raised in a my family had a house in the suburbs, but I was mostly raised in the barrio, so where my grandparents lived. So
in Nevada.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh, yeah.
with your grandparents.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about your family of origin and how it was growing up?
Yeah, my dad has spent most of his life in California. He was born in Council Bluffs, Iowa, but my mom's side of the family immigrated over from Mazatlan, Mexico in her 20s when she met my dad, and so that's where all our family is from on my mom's side, which is in and around the region of Mazatlan, Mexico. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Did you have brothers, sisters?
I do. I have an older half brother and an older half sister from a previous marriage that my mom had. It was part of the reason that she was fleeing Mexico was from that relationship. And then I have a younger brother who same dad, same mom, and he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Very early age, having a relationship with him is difficult sometimes.
A brother with schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Me too. My youngest brother developed schizophrenia as about a mid-teenager.
Yeah, about the same time my brother
Same
did.
time. Went to Vietnam, had a difficult time, came home and committed suicide.
Yeah.
But he received Christ about a year before that. Oddly enough.
Yeah.
Oddly enough. So.
And I wasn't raised in a Christian home. Most of my family, particularly on my mom's side, is Catholic. So, we were required to attend Mass when I was younger, but it was more obligation than it was relationship.
Okay.
So by the time I was old enough to speak for myself, I stopped going to Mass.
Okay.
I went to a high school very near to where I spent most of my days in that area. There was a metal detector. It was a closed campus. It was
you're talking Whittier area now.
This is actually just outside of La Puente, so the high school that I went to was mostly Hispanic and Asian in terms of its kind of minority diversity.
Okay. Yeah, it parallels a little bit about where I grew up, just at the head of the San Fernando Valley.
Yeah.
In Gangland, USA.
Yeah.
That was my background.
Well, that's kind of what I fell into as a kid. So I started prospecting with one of the larger Latino gangs in the area there. And so I got myself into a fair share of trouble as a teenager. I almost stabbed a kid by the time I was, 17. Then there was a large carjacking incident that scared my dad enough to move me high schools. And he probably saved my life by doing that, and which is where I ended up meeting my wife.
Yeah. So about everything you're saying, Alan, I can identify with it. My first arrest, I had 2 felony arrests when I was 15.
Really?
Oh yeah.
I didn't know
you were. I was not a good boy.
I didn't know you were such a rebel, Kent.
Not a good boy. Not
right.
Not your ideal kid, but proved to be an embarrassment to my parents a few times.
Yeah.
Sadly enough. But so, what high school did you graduate from?
I graduated. So the high school that my father transferred me to was Roland High School in Roland Heights, California, which was a little further inland from where I was at the time, and so a little further east, I should say, and I only did half of my junior year and my senior year there.
Play sports in school?
I did.
Wouldn't have been baseball, would it?
It was. A little baseball, a little football. So, most people don't know that the sport that I excelled at was tennis.
Tennis?
Yeah, I was a 4-year varsity tennis player, and I was
Really?
actually ranked in the state of California at one point. And
Wow.
so tennis was my main sport for a long time.
Wow, Alan. That's,
Which is strange considering where and how I grew up.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was on the tennis team for about a month, and I got caught smoking cigarettes, and the coach threw me off the team.
You deserved it. No.
I did. That's true. I love tennis too.
Yeah. Well, my dad played tennis, so
He did. Yeah.
and the marriage between my dad and my mom was not very good. It was a pretty violent and abusive home that I grew up in, and I would say that the only way that I was going to get time with my dad was to follow him to the country club and
Play tennis.
and learn how to play tennis.
Wow.
And so I got real good at it because I wanted to be around my dad.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I know you're an athlete. What happened after your high school days?
Well, I met a girl in high school, got her pregnant, and
I did the same thing.
yeah, you dog. Looking at the two of us, now I see the resemblance. I get it now.
I did the same thing, Alan.
So, and it's weird because the option was, do we get an abortion? And kind of move on with our lives? And I didn't have any moral or spiritual framework to guide me in that decision. What I now kind of just attribute to as the grace of God was this part of my personality that felt responsible for what had happened, and I wanted to take responsibility for it. I think my girlfriend, who is now my wife, at the time felt the same way. So I actually was already on a trajectory into the United States Marine Corps at this point. I had mostly cleaned up my life, knew that I needed structure. The military was really the best option and path for me, which was only solidified by the fact that I was going to be a young dad, just given the health care and the stability of the benefits given to me by the Marine Corps. And so after high school, I shipped off to boot camp, and then I got married during one of my breaks, and my wife moved out to 29 Palms with me.
You won't believe the parallels. I did the same thing, except not the Marine Corps. I was in the Air Force. I was a medic.
Oh, that's too bad.
I was a medic in the Air Force for 4 years.
My dad was in the Air Force, so.
Was he?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I had no choice. I had no way of making a living. I had a pregnant wife.
Yeah.
And no way to support her, nowhere to live.
Yeah.
And the military literally rescued me.
Yeah.
I wasn't a Christian at that point, but
yeah.
Now,
I was not.
You were not a Christian.
I was the farthest thing from it.
You were the farthest thing from it, Alan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I would have said at that point that Christians were morally hypocritical and intellectually deceitful is how that's kind of the framework that I operated from probably at that point in my life.
Yeah. I cared very little for Christians. My dad had become a Christian when I was 15, the Billy Graham Crusade.
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about what that was.
Yeah.
But I started feeling judged by him.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, after the military, I thought I was going to go into law enforcement, and then I ended up, having a lucrative business career, and I had my whole life had to take care of myself, fend for myself, figure out how to take care of my family, and the idea that I needed anyone was untenably, realistic for the way that I thought about the world at that point.
How did you, after you got out of the Marine Corps, what did you do? How did you make a living?
Well, I thought I was going to go into law enforcement. I had an uncle who worked for LAPD, and that was a really attractive option for me as a young man coming out of the military. And so while I was processing with various law enforcement agencies, I had to earn a wage to take care of my family. And I fell into a career called asset protection and loss prevention, which ascended into corporate investigations, Sarbanes-Oxley, misappropriation. So I ended up, at the end of my career, I ended up at a large Fortune 500 company overseeing that internal department for them.
Wow. Wow. That's a trajectory that very few probably found at that point in your circumstances.
Well, really young too. I was highly ambitious and highly motivated, I liked the fact also that I could do it on my own. So we ended up living in New Orleans for a while. One promotion took us to New Orleans. Another promotion took us to Florida, which is where we spent about 7 years. So my second child, Tyler, was born in New Orleans, and the next two would be born in Florida.
Would you like to talk about Tyler a little bit?
Sure.
I've seen your son.
Yeah.
And I don't know, what happened.
Well, we knew Tyler. So when we did one of the first ultrasounds, when my wife Shannon was pregnant with Tyler, we knew he was going to be born with a birth defect called gastroschisis. Now, not that you would want a birth defect, but if you wanted one, this is the one you would want because it's highly repairable and you go on to live mostly a normal life. It's basically part of the intestine is left unformed outside of the body. So the baby's born, you put the intestine back in, and you go on to live mostly a normal life. But there is a risk that as the gastroschisis inflames and moves, that it can put stress on the baby in utero, and so which is exactly what happened to Tyler. So we got a call. Shannon went in one day. She hadn't felt him move in a while. This was late into the pregnancy. She got there. They did an emergency C-section. By the time I showed up, they'd already gotten him out. They were prepping him for surgery for the gastroschisis repair. And then a few weeks later, while we were waiting to bring him home, he was in the NICU after surgery, which went well. We got a call from the hospital asking us to come in the middle of the night, and they had witnessed what was described as seizure-like activity. So they began to perform a variety and host of scans. And
this is just a little baby.
He's only a few weeks old at this point, and what they discovered was that the reason she hadn't felt him move on the day that he was born was because he was losing oxygen, and so that process damaged most of his brain, with the exception of brainstem function. So it's kind of the injury is lumped under what we call cerebral palsy, but cerebral palsy is everything from a deformity of the hand, the inability to use a hand, to my son who can't walk, talk on his own, who can't care for himself, and whose lifespan is compromised. So.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Alan. I had a chance to see him.
Yeah.
And I knew that it was pretty substantial. But
yeah, well, I kind of looked. And I know what you mean. I'm not sorry at all. My entire worldview has been really shifted, beginning with Tyler. And what I would say is if you don't start with the idea that there's a creator and there's a God, well, then Tyler's life is a waste. It's pointless. He just got a bad. And if to anybody who's had a hard life or a painful life or whatever, then outside of the Christian worldview, then the answer is, well, you got the bad luck of the draw. It's just a waste. Yeah. But within a Christian framework, within an idea that there is a creator who redeems everything and will redeem everything, then what you can begin to see is that even Tyler's condition has purpose and value and significance, because someday, one day, all that will be set right according to the worldview that I believe. Yeah. And it just so happens that part of Tyler's plan and purpose was to save his dad. And
this is what we want to get to, Alan.
Yeah.
I have to, another connection, oddly, this Sunday, my sermon is the healing of the man who was born blind,
Yeah.
who Jesus made the mud, told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And what you're saying is pretty much what R.C. Sproul, one of my favorite commentators,
Yeah.
said about that incident.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's almost like you read him this morning.
I did not.
You didn't know? Okay. Now, so how did you come across Christians? Did you come? What happened? You find a Bible? Somebody?
Well, when Tyler was born, it kind of only entrenched me in the idea that there can't be a God. If
that there can't be a God.
There can't be. If there's a God, he's not good. But certainly there is not a God. That's kind of where I operated from after Tyler was born. And so but my wife had a different polarizing response, which was she began to kind of press into God. And so one of the women who really helped her through the time that when Tyler was first born was a woman named Nancy, who was part of a local church that Shannon found a lot of comfort from and a lot of support from. They loved her really, really well. And so Shannon started inviting me to church. I rejected every time she asked, numerous times, until eventually I agreed to go to church with her, mostly in my mind to shut her up.
Now, where was this at, Alan?
We're living in Orlando, Florida at the time.
Orlando, Florida.
Yeah. So we're living right in what would be kind of stereotypical Christians who operate in stereotypical ways, and they kind of feed into the way Christians are modeled and purported to be in the media and in the culture at large. So this is actually the kind of church that we ended up in that feeded it into that stereotype, because when we brought Tyler, this was my first time dealing with Tyler's condition in public, we were asked to leave.
What?
Yeah. When Tyler, at that time in his life, when he got excited, he would make these little cooing noises. And those noises were viewed as a disturbance to the congregation, and so we got asked to leave, which obviously upended my wife. It entrenched my already preconceived opinions about everything, and so off I went. And so my wife, she wasn't dissuaded by the fact that Christians can be what they are, which is human beings in need of a God who redeems them, changes them, both their hearts and their works. She wasn't going to hold that against God. She was going to hold that where it rightfully belonged, which is against those people who needed more of Jesus, not less of Jesus. That was the problem. So she found another church. And when she did that, she started asking me to go again. So we went, or I said no repeatedly again. And so finally one day I kind of agreed to go again, and mostly to, in my mind, to kind of stop the nagging every Sunday, or what I viewed was nagging.
Sure.
And so we went to this church, and in the middle of the pastor's sermon, Tyler let out the biggest, loudest, most inappropriate belch you've ever heard in your life. And so I'm sitting there going, here it comes, hypocrite moment. And one of the elders is standing by the door, and we look over, and he goes like this. And so it kind of disarmed me, because I expected more of the same. That was a different response than we had previously received. So I, unfortunately, in my mind, had to keep attending, because they hadn't done anything that reaffirmed what I already suspected.
If you just could have been offended, I could have stopped going. Quit, Alan, altogether.
So then eventually my wife invited me to this family's house that was, hosting a small group where they did dinner and Bible study and stuff like that. And I very carefully waded into those waters after, again, more protest. And what I saw, the leader of the group, his name is a gentleman by the name of Gary Boothe. He was from the Northeast. He was a Patriots fan. I was a Raiders fan.
You were a whose fan?
Raiders.
Raiders.
You'd
be a Raider fan, all right.
So we could, we could argue about football and be regular guys, but what I noticed about Gary, especially the way that I grew up, was that he treated people differently. People he disagreed with, he treated differently, with kindness and dignity and value and worth. He treated his wife differently than I'd ever seen, treated his children differently. The way that he cared for them, the way that he disciplined them, the way that he engaged with them was foreign to me. And so one of the days, Gary asks me, hey, have you ever really investigated why you don't believe in God?
Huh.
And I said...
He said, why you didn't believe?
Yeah, and I said, I haven't really thought of that. Why? And so he was pushing into me. He was saying, don't you think that the nature of things, the creation of all things, that everything that matters in this world, is there or is there not a God? Shouldn't you be able to speak intelligently about why you've come to that conclusion? And I was like, well, have you? And he's like, yes, that's the difference between me and you. I have heard all of the secular arguments, but I've also investigated all of the spiritual arguments, the Christian arguments. So if you're going to denounce God, maybe you should pick up a book. Maybe you should investigate for yourself why you believe that rather than out of something subjective. So I did.
So
I set off to prove that I was right.
So what book did you pick up?
The Bible.
Oh boy.
Well, to start with, there were some other, what I really started researching was kind of the extra biblical evidence for Christ, the history of the church,
really?
The history of Jesus. Is he someone that really existed, or is he a fairy tale concocted within the scriptures? And so the more I investigated the history, the more I investigated, how Christianity complements our scientific evidence, not dismisses it out of hand, which is what I think most people think we do.
Right.
The more that I saw all of that, the more this disturbance started to arise in me. And then one day, coming home from a business trip out of Atlanta, I got stuck in the rain, and Gary had slipped a Bible into my bag.
He slipped it?
Yeah. And so I had to pull over. I went to pull out my laptop, and there was a little Bible, and he had it bookmarked and highlighted to Luke 7.
Luke 7.
Yeah. And the story is there's a woman who is desperate, and so she takes her most valuable possession, and she shows up at the house of Simon the Pharisee because she heard that he's going to be dining there. She heard that he's come to town, and by he, I mean Jesus. And so she falls to the floor and she makes a scene, and this perfume bottle that she smashes on the floor is symbolic of this very, very valuable piece of property that would have been passed down for generations in her family. And Simon, who's the host, begins to respond internally with indignity. Yes, that she's making a scene, but more so that Jesus is tolerating her scene. And so Jesus looks up at Simon and says, Simon, let me ask you a question. One person owes Visa $1,000. Another owes Visa $10,000. Visa calls you and says, we're canceling both debts. Who's more grateful? Simon says, the one with the greater debt canceled. So I'm reading this on the side of the road between Atlanta and Orlando, and I'm thinking to myself, I don't identify with this woman at all. Because it seems like what that metaphor was meant to imply is, Simon, you're pretty good. You don't have a big debt. She's pretty bad. She has a big debt. She needs God because she's such a bad sinner. You're such a good guy. You need to go out and sin like hell in order to understand what she understands. When you do that, we'll have more to talk about. So I don't identify with this woman at all that I think Gary's trying to get me to identify with. And after starting and stopping...
Well, you were tough, Alan.
Yeah, well...
Holy mackerel.
Well, then the rain would let up. I would drive. The rain would come back. I would stop. And this would go on for a while. And somewhere around Gainesville, Florida, it dawns on me as I'm reading this passage that he's not trying to get me to identify with the woman. He's trying to get me to identify with Simon.
The Pharisee.
Alan, you think you're a pretty good guy. You didn't abandon your wife when she was pregnant. You didn't abandon your family when you had a severely compromised child. You've taken care of them. You've provided a good life for them. And you pay your taxes on time. You're a pretty good guy. See, here's what you don't understand. She understands grace at a much larger capacity because of how she perceives herself. Therefore, her capacity for God's work in her life is bigger. You perceive yourself less so. You have an atrophied view of grace in your life, Simon. And so you don't think you have a lot to be forgiven for because you think you're such a good guy. Mm-hmm. So your capacity, your openness to the work of God in your life is diminished. See, what you don't understand, Alan, is you need God just as much as she does. You need Jesus just like her. And that was when you put the two things, investigating the truth claims of Scripture and God moving in how I see myself fundamentally to the core as a person, that when those two things come into conjunction with one another, when they intersect with one another, transformation happens, and it just changed my life completely.
Wow. Fabulous, Alan, and we just got that story just before we're going to sign off here at this program, but we're going to be doing more. We're going to do it again. We're going to do another half hour.
Oh, awesome. Great.
And we'll just have a little break in between. Thanks for the story. I think it's one of the most original ways in which I've heard the gospel presented, and I really loved it. Thank you. Oh, wonderful.
Well, thank you, Kent.
All right. So we've been talking with Alan Coleman. We've got to the point where he's now a believer in Jesus, and we got to get him from that point to this point where he's at right now. And that's what we're going to be doing. So be looking out for the next edition of Why We Are Christians. We'll finish our conversation with Alan Coleman. All right, Alan.
Thanks, Kent.
All right,
Appreciate
buddy.
it.
So long.